Cybertruck's legacy is that it was designed to use less copper. You know, copper, the kind of reddish metal. In 2024, the Cybertruck, think it's ugly or cool, is the it car. Marquez Brownlee drives one. Justin Bieber drives one. Kim Kardashian got pulled over driving a Cybertruck. Mr. Beast gave away like 10 of them to influencers.
How did they get this many Cybertrucks in one place?
Even Colin and Samir are somehow in a position to be giving away the Cybertruck.
This is crazy.
I wanted to not like this. I hate to say, this is amazing.
This is cool.
All right, if you want to enter to win,
Everybody wants a Cybertruck, which is why you can win this toy Cybertruck. And I realize what an uncompelling incentive it might be. So, I'm gonna stuff it with cash. You win this thing, you get paid. There's cash inside the Cybertruck, bitch. I'll explain how to win this at the end of the video. On a number of occasions throughout my life, I've seen new cars that look really weird. And they make a big splash because they look really weird. There was the new Volkswagen Beetle, which came out in 1998.
An icon, a classic.
A revamp of the cute little car that the Nazis made? That's true, yeah. It made a splash. It was fun looking.
I happen to own one, and it is one of my favorite things. I call it my Toodle car.
Oprah was giving them away.
How about if we give each person in your audience the brand new, totally redesigned 2012 Volkswagen Beetle?
Apple was doing collaborations with it to make the iPod seem cool. It even became socially acceptable to punch your friend or your sibling if you saw one. If you were the first to spot a Volkswagen Beetle, it was acceptable to hit somebody, pow, and say punch buggy, and you're off the hook. Where's the new Volkswagen Beetle today? Oh, they stopped making it in 2019. You probably didn't even notice. Gone. It is gone. And my prediction is that within 20 years, the Cybertruck will be gone. In 20 years, you're gonna see a Cybertruck and be like, that idiot is stuck in 2024 driving that thing. But unlike some of these other weird cars, the Cybertruck will impart a legacy onto all other cars in the future. And no, it's not because it looks weird. It's not the steer-by-wire. It's not the rear wheel steering or any of that shit. In fact, as the driver, the most important innovation on the Cybertruck will probably be invisible. With its 48-volt architecture and also power over Ethernet system, the Cybertruck is designed to use way less copper than all other cars, especially EVs. And that actually does make the Cybertruck futuristic. And the key to understanding the significance of the Cybertruck is to understand that all cars are really a sort of symphony of thousands and thousands of parts, a lot of which are not actually made by the car company that's like making the car. Most cars you get, most cars that aren't the Cybertruck, have a lot of what's called off-the-shelf parts. There are other companies that we, the consumer, haven't heard of, but they're making all kinds of parts throughout the car. And there are gigantic global supply chains providing so many parts inside the car that you don't even see. This makes it so that the car manufacturer doesn't have to redesign every part in the car every time they make a new car, and it also helps them keep costs down. The Cybertruck is completely foregoing all these global supply chains that make cars cheap, and instead creating a brand new supply chain and passing off the costs of creating this supply chain to idiots like Kim Kardashian and Justin Bieber and Mr. Beast, who are willing to pay a premium just to drive the weird looking car before everybody else does. And I respect that. To understand the significance of the Cybertruck, you have to understand the history of copper. There are a number of things about copper that are pretty unusual for a metal. For one, copper exists in its native state in nature, which means that, you know, at least as of thousands of years ago, there were like rocks essentially made out of copper. More or less pure copper. Not pure copper. There's probably like some dirt and shit mixed into it, but for the most part, pure copper. Most other metals on the periodic table don't actually exist in nature in their native form the way copper does. There aren't really any other metals that have this color. Most other metals are like silver or gray. It's also relatively soft. It's not like super hard, so it's pretty easy to like melt and to turn into different shapes. This is why like a cable can be flexible. It's got copper on the inside. And most importantly, copper was the first metal that human beings ever used to create tools. Before humans came along and mined all the copper freely available on the surface of the earth, it wasn't so uncommon to find like chunks, like rocks, basically entirely made out of copper. And early humans, going back to as far as like 10,000, 12,000 years ago, would actually create tools, things like axes or, you know, rudimentary tools out of copper. Because you could basically sculpt copper into a tool. That was really, really useful. By about 5000 BCE, humans had figured out how to smelt copper. This means that rather than getting copper in its native state, we figured out how to heat up ores and separate out the copper from other minerals. This is before we invented writing or reading or any of that shit. We figured out how to smelt copper. By 4000 BCE, we had figured out how to cast copper into a mold and make, like, you know, molded copper things. And by about 3500 BCE, we had figured out how to turn copper into an alloy. You mix copper with tin and you get bronze. And the big advantage of this is that it created a metal that was much harder than pure copper and therefore made for a much better or lethal tool. We started making all kinds of tools like swords, and shields, and all kinds of shit out of bronze, or really copper. The Egyptians kind of figured out that if you like drank out of copper, like the water didn't really get contaminated, you didn't get sick. It's used in a lot of medical applications because copper has antimicrobial properties. Bacteria won't grow on it. Copper is also used in coins like the penny. As copper got more valuable, they stopped putting copper inside the penny. They put zinc inside, but they still coated in copper. They made the Statue of Liberty out of copper. Copper turns kind of a aqua greenish color when it oxidizes. Rain on copper and then it sits in the air in sunlight for a while. It turns greenish. Jewelry, a lot of like gold alloys, like different carats of gold that actually have copper in it, like my stupid ass chain here. Almost certainly, I haven't checked, but almost certainly has copper in it. What took way longer for us to discover and use on any sort of industrial scale was the fact that copper is the second best metal for conducting electricity. That makes copper the backbone of all things electronic. And even though electricity is barely over 100 years old, at this point, overwhelmingly, most of the copper that human beings have ever used has been for this. Take apart almost any electronics, copper. Strip a wire, copper. Motors. Electric vehicles use lots of copper because those motors are essentially just big coils of copper. And as our demand for all kinds of electronic goods is growing at an insane rate, that means that our demand for copper is also growing at an insane rate. And it's kind of a problem. The problem is that despite our insatiable demand for copper, we actually really hate copper mining. And there's a reason why you probably don't live near a copper mine, because copper mining sucks. Or mining of any sort is something that you don't want to be near at all. Here's the basic way that mining works. This is largely true for mining of anything, but this video is obviously about copper. You start with a piece of land in which the soil or the rock below it has a pretty decent concentration of copper ore. Today, a pretty decent concentration of copper ore means that it's upwards of 1% copper, 99% or more than 99% anything else. So you got your rock here, right? This is quartz, but we're going to pretend this is copper ore. Imagine that 1% of this is copper, 99% everything else. Well, that makes it worth mining. So you get permission to mine the rocks out of the ground, which is really, really, really hard. Don't underestimate how much people hate, especially rich people with nice houses. Do not underestimate how much people hate living near a mine. People hate mining. On average, it takes like 20 years to start a new copper mine because whoever lives near the copper mine is always unhappy about it. There's always somebody fighting it. Even if they manage to get the copper mine through, it is a massive undertaking with like regulations and permitting. First and foremost, because it completely destroys the environment. Talk about like climate change, like burning gasoline, and we're increasing the parts per million of carbon dioxide from like 300 to 450 over time. That heats up the atmosphere and like glaciers melt and you end up with climate change. It's a pretty abstract problem, even though most people seem to agree that it's happening. It's abstract enough that it allows for disagreement at all. Mining, on the other hand, take a pristine environment and start mining it. That mining fucks up the environment. It fucks up the environment in a very direct, obvious way. such that nobody debates it. Imagine you take Aspen, Colorado, and imagine that like underneath the mountains there, they realize there's a bunch of copper ore that's like 2 or 3%. That copper ore is not coming out of the ground because the insanely rich people who live in Aspen would never, ever agree to let Aspen be destroyed just to get more copper. No, it would never happen. So you take your rock out of the ground, and remember, at best, this is 1% copper. You then go and like pulverize it. You like smash this rock up and basically turn it into like as fine of like kind of a sand as possible. And then you submerge it in acid to remove whatever part of it is copper from everything else. But the copper that gets mined out of the earth and sent to factories elsewhere, that's not the problem. The problem is what's left over. And what's left over is still all the rock that you just had. Now you've mixed it with acid and pulverized it, so it's like acidic sludge rock. And then you also have like all this like acidic water that ideally you can evaporate. And so they put tailing ponds. If you ever like fly over a mine, you often see like a big like turquoise pool. This like turquoise pool is still like full of acid, and you don't want to live near it. You don't want your drinking water being anywhere near this tailing pond. And then you still have to figure out where to store the 99% of the rock that didn't have any copper in it. That basically all gets put back on the same site and like redistributed, just sort of figuring out where the fuck can we store this rock so we can continue mining new areas but keep putting back the old stuff. You take a pristine environment and you destroy it in order to get the 1 or 0.5% of the soil or rock or whatever that has copper in it. Nobody wants to live near that shit. It's terrible. So we find ourselves in a predicament where everybody wants an iPhone or maybe an electric car, even this toy electric car, just so it can light up a little bit. Still has copper in it. Even gasoline cars still have a lot of electronics. A gasoline car has like 20 or 30 kilograms on average of copper all throughout the car. Turn that car into an EV and you probably like double or triple the amount of copper. We're producing more cars than ever before, and all these cars are supposed to be more electric than ever before. A lot of sustainable technology like heat pumps or wind turbines or PV panels, solar panels, all that takes copper too. And on top of that, everybody around the world is getting smartphones and laptops and fucking, smart watches that don't really make you smarter, but it all has tons and tons and tons of copper in it. Our demand for copper is stratospheric and only growing, and we don't have any obvious new sources of copper anywhere that we can just easily get. It's always like a big fight. So just because we all want to start driving EVs does not mean we're going to just magically have more copper available to make all these EVs. It's actually a huge problem. And there's no need to write a comment telling me that I'm an idiot and I forgot about deep sea mining, because even if we figure it out eventually, that shit does not exist yet, and it's not anywhere near ready to produce copper on an industrial scale. No. And so any way in which we can figure out how to use less copper is a winning idea. Which brings me to this stupid toy I've got here. What kind of idiot would buy a Cybertruck toy, right? So, love or hate the Cybertruck, this is where the Cybertruck is truly the future. Because this fucking weird ass car is designed to use like 70% less copper than an ordinary EV. That's a big deal. And there are two primary mechanisms by which the Cybertruck uses a lot less copper. The first is that it's got 48 volt architecture, which allows you to use thinner wiring that use less copper. And the second one is that the Cybertruck has what's called power over Ethernet, which means that all the data cables throughout the car are also the power cables. And rather than having every single electronic component throughout the car have at least one wire leading directly back to the central computer, you can then have all these different electronic components throughout the car daisy-chained together and collectively remove a huge amount of wiring simply by combining the power and Ethernet onto the same cable. Since basically as long as we've been having cars be electronic, which was probably from like the 1950s or maybe even earlier in the 20th century, all cars have been 12 volt systems. Cars from like 70 years ago still had like headlights and maybe they had a radio, but they didn't have all kinds of other systems. They didn't have airbags. They didn't have little sensors that tell you whether or not the door is open or closed. They didn't have little motors in the seats to keep the seat moving back and forth. Little buttons. Oh, I'm going to push the button and move my seat back and forth. Older cars didn't have that. It wasn't even all that long ago that cars, you had to like manually crank the windows. Now cars all have motors. You just hit a button and the windows roll up or down. Modern minivans have motors in the doors. A lot of like hatchbacks have little motors that move the doors up and down. Backup cameras or LiDAR systems to alert you if you're going to crash into something. Seat heaters. You hit a button and your seat starts to warm up. There are so many electrical components all throughout the car that are all designed for 12-volt architecture. As cars became more and more complex, we started adding all these features, which just kind of steadily accumulated over time. And suddenly the wiring inside these cars has become super complex. The wiring is called a harness. Modern cars have super complex harnesses that not only use a lot of wiring and copper, but it just takes like a lot of labor to install. It's very complicated. If you have any issues, like rats got into my car and chewed through some of the wiring, the whole harness has to get replaced. It's just a fucking mess. All of this could be simplified, but the problem is that the legacy systems make it pretty hard to simplify this if you still want to keep using all the off-the-shelf parts that the entire automobile industry globally is offering you for cheap and without having to reinvent the wheel every time you design a new car. Now, there's something called Joule's law, which is the power loss equation, which basically means, like, have you ever used electronic devices that are just like, they're like getting hot or warm even though they're not supposed to actually heat up? There's a certain amount of energy wasted just as electricity travels through a wire. These are what are known as like resistance losses. And these like resistance losses are predictable. There's a coefficient R in the power loss equation. In the power loss equation, P, the amount of power you're losing, equals I squared times R. R is the resistance coefficient, which is higher if you have a thinner cable, multiplied by the square of your current measured in amps. So the higher your current and your resistance losses become exponentially higher. So the theory behind switching from 12 to 48 volt architecture is that you increase the volts, lower the amps, and use the same amount of power measured in watts. And then in the power loss equation, since you're lowering the square of your current, there's a lot less power loss. And what that means functionally is you can use a thinner gauge cable to supply the same amount of power and not waste a lot of heat, which is important for efficiency's sake. With power over Ethernet, you basically take the same principle that's in any like USB-C cable that you've been using forever, where the cable can supply both power or data. You could use this cable in theory to like charge your phone. You could also use it to like back up a hard drive. It'll also power the hard drive too. You don't have to have two cables. With power over Ethernet, so much more data can be transferred over the cable. Rather than having every single electronic component in the car all have its own wire going directly back to the central computer somewhere, you can take all these different electronic devices and daisy chain them together. One cable goes to the next component and then to the next component and then to the next component. And so, by both switching to 48 volt architecture instead of 12 volt and by upgrading to power over Ethernet, the Cybertruck has a lot less cabling. The cables can be thinner and there are just fewer of them. And to be fair, switching to 48 volt architecture or power over Ethernet is not that groundbreaking of an idea. The reason that this is impressive isn't because the idea is so genius. It's not an original idea at all. What's impressive is that in order to build the Cybertruck, Tesla completely bypassed all the existing supply chains of off-the-shelf car parts. They are blazing a trail, creating an entire new supply chain of car parts that didn't exist before, just to make it possible to switch to 48 volt architecture. And by making the Cybertruck a weird looking shape and generating all this hype for it, where Elon throws the fucking ball that breaks the window publicly and people are like shooting the Cybertruck to show that it's bulletproof, you generate all this hype for it. Rich people are willing to pay way more for this stupid fucking car than they should, but that makes it work out economically to have a new car that was a lot more expensive to make simply because it can't use any of the existing supply chains of parts. They have to reinvent the entire car. Every single part in the car has to get reinvented. All the expenses for that get paid for by all the idiots who just want to have the shiny new car. In 20 years, nobody's going to be driving the Cybertruck. Kim Kardashian and Justin Bieber will be driving something else. The Cybertruck will be a sad relic of, the mid-2020s. But 48 volt architecture and power over Ethernet will probably live on in the supply chains. There will probably be a large new supply chain created with 48-volt parts using power over Ethernet, just because the Cybertruck and Elon, that guy, they went through the huge, massive undertaking that nobody else wanted to do, even though they all had the idea, foregoing all the existing supply chains and starting brand new ones for the sake of efficiency. And I respect that, even though I'm not going to get one of these stupid things. This is why the Cybertruck will have a legacy in ways that the drivers of the Cybertruck won't really be able to experience under the hood, inside the harness, whatever. The Cybertruck is actually pretty cool, even if you hate to admit it, even if you don't want to give Tesla any more attention, which I don't. For this one thing, it is actually pretty cool. Hi, my name's Will. I'm a video producer based in New York, and I make my living pointing fancy cameras like this one at famous people. And since I have all these video production capabilities, I want to make cooler shit. So I'm making videos about technology and materialism, and I want to share them with you. I'm going to be giving away a bunch of things. I'm going to be giving away the stupid-ass toy Cybertruck, but stuffed with cash, which makes it more valuable. And I'm also going to be giving away the copper bar in the thumbnail of this video. Fuck it, I might even give away this copper tray too. You want some metal? You could take this to the scrapyard. If you want to win this stuff, it would be really nice if you hit the subscribe button. Obviously, I want you to do that. But the way to win is to sign up for my email list. There's a link in the video description below. Click it, sign up, and I will reach out only when I have another video. When I've made a new video and I want to share it, I'll email you about it. And if you're worried about me spamming you, just remember that like me emailing you creates work. I have to like figure out what to write to my email list. I don't want to do that very often. You're not going to hear from me that much. You're only going to hear from me if I have a new video to share. If you're already on my email list, just open my emails and I can see who's opening them, and I'm going to give those people prizes too. You don't need to sign up again. As long as you're opening my emails, you're going to get prizes too. That's why we're giving away so many different prizes, because there's a lot of different people who deserve them. Anybody who wants to support my sad channel, I think deserves a prize. And I know these days there's a lot of shiny objects out there competing for your attention. You could be watching OnlyFans. You could be signing up for CNN Plus. I don't know why the fuck anybody would do that. You could be watching Mr. Beast. But instead, you've decided to watch one of my videos. And I just want to say, I can't tell you how much that means to me. Thank you so much for finding your way here to the Will Chilton YouTube channel. Goodbye.